Good afternoon and welcome to day 3 of the AURP Virtual International Conference. I'm Kevin Byrne, President and CEO of the University Financing Foundation, and I'm tired. I don't know about you all, but I barely got any sleep last night. I had a couple of things on my mind. And one of the things that was interesting too is I got to teach a 12-year-old about U.S. politics. That was fun. My son Thomas is in the 6th grade, so it's the perfect time when we're starting to learn social studies, civics lessons. And so last night was just a great opportunity. He got to stay up a little extra time as we watched results. So this session is not about my son, but it's about the results from last night. And we've got a fantastic group of panelists that are going to explain some of the things that happened and then predict some of the things that we don't know yet. We call this Decision 2020, predictions for the future. Like I said, we have a great group of panelists. Let me introduce them now, and then I'm going to get out of the way for the most part and let them talk. So I'll introduce everybody. They'll all come on the screen, and then I'll ask some general questions. So first we have Leslie Gilbert, who's a vice president at Vanscoyac Associates. We have Tom Quinn, a vice president at Vanscoyac Associates. We have Charles Ross, who's the CEO of NBIA, the International Business Innovation Association. We have Dan Berglund, who's the president and CEO of SSTI, the State Science and Technology Institute, and Brian Darmody, our fantastic CEO of the Association of University Research Parks. One thing I'll say before I ask the general question is, one, thank you to Vanscoyac. They are sponsors for the program, so we're thankful for that. But they're also our biggest liaison and advocate for innovation policy through SSTI, through TUF, and through AURP. We support some of the work, and they give us weekly updates and are advocates for innovation. So we thank them for that. We also thank very much Dan Berglund, who runs SSTI and is the primary liaison for us between Vanscoyac and the Innovation Advocacy Council that we've created to support us through this innovation policy. This group of 6 panelists, as we have prepared for this event, have gotten into a lot of details, and it's been fun just listening, be a fly on the wall. So I'm going to sit back and rock on the porch and listen to them talk about some of the things that they saw. So I'll generally ask everybody this one question. First, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'll ask generally, before we get into some of the details about innovation policy, we've been at this for 24 hours. We've seen some things happen. Just tell me generally what your all's thoughts are and opinions are on the results, some of the unknown results, some of the things that we do know, and then looking forward. I'll start with Dan Berglund, if you want to start, and then I'll just either call on you or everybody just join in.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. Appreciate it. And I gave up around midnight and went to bed, figuring that it wouldn't be decided. And like you, having lived through 2000, not knowing how long it might be, I decided I needed my sleep. I mean, I guess the main reaction that I had, 2 things. One was just how badly the pollsters got it again this time around, and really seeing that across the board, not just on the presidential and state polls, but in Senate races and on the state level as well. So surprised by that, and then also the thought of the gridlock. My assumption at this point is that Biden will reach the 270 number. He'll become president, but that the Senate will be controlled by the Republicans. And so thinking about the gridlock that we'll have for the next 2 years and the challenges that that will create is my main
Perfect.
reaction.
Perfect. All right, Tom, Leslie, y'all want to join in and then kind of take over as well?
Sure, I'm happy to get started. And I want to echo a lot of what Dan said. I think watching the returns last night, it was pretty obvious that a lot of the polling that had been publicly made available through the cable news, through the media, did seem to be off in a number of states. And where I'm going to focus, rather than on the presidential election, is really on Capitol Hill. And I think you have to categorize yesterday as a very disappointing day for congressional Democrats who went into Election Day expecting big things for the party. I think the chances right now that we're going to see Republicans likely pick up seats in the House, the way things are sitting right now, there's about 7 to 10 seats that Republicans look like they were about to flip in the House of Representatives. If you talked to congressional Democrats a week ago, that would have been something incredibly surprising. Instead of sitting somewhere around 180 or so seats, the Republicans look like they're going to have at least 200 seats next year. And that's a very powerful minority for the House of Representatives. In that same vein, while we're waiting for the Senate votes to finish being counted, I think it has to be a pretty big surprise to a lot of Democrats how these races have shaken out. Like Dan said, the polling showed Democrats with a pretty significant advantage in a lot of states, like Maine, for instance. But instead, we saw the Maine race just called a few minutes ago. We saw South Carolina called last night with a pretty significant win for Lindsey Graham. Looking at just the races in places like Kentucky, South Carolina, and Texas, Democratic donors gave more than $220 million just for those 3 races. And when you look at the results, even though they're not even final right now, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Texas are not close races right now. So I think there's going to be a lot of reflection, despite what might be happening at the top of the ticket. I think congressional Democrats are going to be having a lot of discussions over the next couple of weeks over not so much what went wrong, but maybe where were they wrong in their expectations. And I'll wrap this up just by saying there are 34 Senate seats that are up for re-election in 2022. Once these votes are all counted in yesterday's election, we're going to start hearing talk about those seats and where the vulnerabilities are then. So my focus last night really was on the changes on Capitol Hill and some of the surprises coming out of there.
So I would say, as usual, I agree with Tom. Obviously, we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in terms of expectations over the last 24 to 48 hours. I think that I would like to focus some attention here on the House. I agree with Tom. I don't think it's going to change over in terms of majority. I do think that the Democrats are going to hold their majority in the House, but they're going to be dealing with a much slimmer majority than they expected, or that pretty much anybody expected. And that's going to definitely have an effect on how Pelosi, at least we're still expecting her to hold the speakership, can govern. She's got a caucus that is decidedly more liberal. A lot of the seats that fell to the Republicans in this cycle were her more moderate types of seats. And so she's got a caucus that wants to move to the left, but she's got less room to do that. So it'll be very interesting to see even how the House will play out over the next couple of years, with this kind of new reality. So very interesting there.
One of the first things Democrats will do behind closed doors in the next few weeks is hold their leadership elections. Mm-hmm. And at this point, I don't know that there'll be a challenge to Speaker Pelosi. You may recall 2 years ago, a group of Democrats did put together a very brief challenge to Nancy Pelosi's speakership. Didn't go very far, and they have the same problem this year they did 2 years ago, is there's not an obvious successor to rally around. Mm-hmm. So while it's unlikely Pelosi would lose her position in leadership, as Leslie said, it's going to be much more difficult for her to wrangle a caucus that's much more left-leaning. Looking at the seats that we know Democrats lost last night, there were 2 in South Florida where Joe Biden is said to have underperformed. A seat in Oklahoma City that might not have been a Democratic seat if not for a midterm election. And Colin Peterson from Minnesota, who's been in Congress since 1991, was really the House Democrats' main, and I don't want to say only, but top representative from the agriculture community. And with his loss, I think that's a big step that Democrats don't have a natural connection to rural America right now, just through their membership in the House.
A couple of other interesting seats that I think didn't go exactly as planned. The southern New Mexico seat, for example, flipped. Xochitl Torres Small lost that seat, again, largely based on some energy pressure down in the southern part of the state. Another seat that very much surprised people, Will Hurd in Texas 23, that was very much expected. He was retiring, but that was very much expected to flip to the Democrats, and it did not. In fact, none of the Texas seats actually flipped. And so, you again see that dynamic where the Republicans actually did a little bit better, particularly in Hispanic-leaning districts, than I think expected over the course of the night. So, very interesting dynamics.
Yeah, there are about 50 House seats that are still yet to be called, and those should be called in the next few days. Some are in areas that had very high mail-in votes. Those take a little longer. Some are in rural areas. So we'll see the House shake out in the next few days. The Senate right now has about 5 seats left that have not been called yet. We see those in North Carolina, Michigan, Alaska, and 2 seats in Georgia. The Georgia seats might take a little while to come out. Michigan's a very tight race. Senator Gary Peters, who's the incumbent, is, last I looked, about 1,000 votes ahead. And I think his luck will go with however Joe Biden finishes up in the state. North Carolina, which I think we all went on a roller coaster ride with last night, especially early in the evening, is looking more and more like Senator Tillis will hold on to that seat by a slim margin. And in Alaska, Senator Sullivan seems to have fended off a Democratic opponent that was getting a little bit of attention in the media, but the poll numbers really never showed real vulnerability there. So the 2 Georgia seats will be interesting to watch. As you know, they have what they call a jungle primary down there, where there's a long list of candidates, the top 2 facing off against each other. Now that it's going to likely be a Republican versus a Democrat in the runoff, that's going to really change the dynamic down there. And I believe the runoff will be January 4th, which is the day after the day of the next Congress convening. So we got a couple of months to wait to see how the Senate's going to finally shape up.
So, Charles, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was going to jump in because, when we were looking at the programming this week, I said, this is going to be on election week, and we should have a session on election, and we called it Decision 2020. Maybe we should have called it Indecision 2020, since we're still waiting for the election. But I want to talk a little bit about the implications on the budget. I know Dan wants to talk about this too, because like in Maryland, our state budget is hurting, and our budgets for higher ed are hurting. And as much as I love research parks and incubators and things like that, when university presidents have to wrestle with budget cuts, research parks and innovation districts aren't going to be high on that list. And our Governor Hogan in Maryland, former head of the NGA, has been pleading for some relief from the for the government, from the federal government. So I guess the question is, and I would like to hear Charles talk about, a lot of his members, I guess, probably get support from their local counties or states, and it all flows through. What really, given the complexion and assuming Trump loses and relinquishes office, let's hope, what will be, how is that going to affect all of our constituencies, especially those based on, economic development coming from the state government and in some cases local governments?
Yeah, and thanks, Brian, for that introduction, and thanks for allowing NBIA to participate in your conference. Want to definitely let you know that we just went through our virtual conference, and I know all of the challenges of converting to virtual, and congratulations on a successful conference. Definitely, I would say the impact that the election results will have, and the ability for us to get new stimulus action out of DC is really top of mind for most of our members. And as you described, our members at NBIA is typically entrepreneurship centers that would include incubators, accelerators, co-worker spaces, and maker spaces. About 30% of our members are actually affiliated with universities. And so there's, a tight linkage there in terms of having experience impact on spending constraints. And in addition to that, for the other 60% or so that are not necessarily affiliated with the university, several of those, a high percentage of those entrepreneurship centers are depending upon state or local municipalities for funding. So that is definitely an issue. And, I think we're going to see an environment similar to what we saw back in, I guess, was the 2008, 2009 timeframe with the Great Recession. And clearly there's going to be a lot of pressure on these programs to hold on to the funding that they're receiving from their stakeholders. I would say that similar to everybody else, Dan, on your comments, I'm wondering how I can be a pollster because it seems like you're paid there and you don't have to have really good results. And Kevin, I was up off and on last night. I think I originally went to bed probably about 11 and then I woke up at about 3 in the morning and I was kind of watching the news. But I was not shocked, of course, by that. But I was encouraged by the fact that just a huge voter turnout that we had, especially in advance, but just a little, definitely concerned about this divide that outside of DC, this divide that we have across all of our communities that, we need to bridge.
And I want to pick up on what Charles just said, because that to me is one of the really concerning things about this election for our field, is that there is such a sharp division in this country. And, when you look at the Twitter feed and the political commentators in terms of what Trump's coalition looks like of white, non-college educated men, rural areas versus a new developing majority of college educated metro and people of color, it's a bifurcation of the country. And if you look at our field, we tend to focus on the college educated and could get grouped in with we're part of the elites. And so I think part of the challenge that we have as a field overall, whether it's a research park, whether it's an incubator, an entrepreneurship center, whether it's a state program, a seed fund, is what is our relevance to those areas outside of major metro areas? And if we're in major metro areas, what's our relevance to those in disadvantaged communities as well? This is going to be, I think, a really challenging time for us in the next few years ahead, because we have these societal issues going on, but we're not going to have the state and potentially not the federal resources to address it. And maybe I pick on Tom and Leslie a little bit to talk about the roadblock. I mean, going into the election, it was, here's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Right before the election, Senate Republicans decided that they cared about the deficit. And so what the prospects are for a stimulus, either in lame duck or after lame duck in a new administration.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll go ahead and start, and then Tom can add in. I definitely think that you will see another, I'm not going to call it a stimulus bill. I'm going to say it's another relief package for sort of COVID response. And why I'm putting into that category some funding for schools, K through 12 and universities, funding for hospitals, medical centers, and more vaccine kind of testing types of things. So I actually wouldn't call it a stimulus in a more traditional way, but more of a continued relief. I definitely think there is a desire to do that. I think that the scope, if things play out the way we think they're going to play out, what we've been discussing, is probably more limited than I would have said 2 days ago or a day ago. And so state and local funding is definitely up in the air as we've been discussing. There could be some, but it's unclear. In terms of timing, if you have this scenario where Biden wins the presidency, the Senate remains in Republican hands. Again, the House has a slightly smaller majority, but still a majority. You could see theoretically a smaller relief package, but I suspect that this is still going to get bumped into the first quarter of next year, late January, early February, just in terms of the fact that we're still going to be playing out this election over the next few days and weeks. And so I don't see that as an immediate response in that regard. So I do think timing wise, Dan, we are looking at probably a first quarter of next year. But I don't know, Tom, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think there's tremendous pressure on Capitol Hill to do something. Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin had been negotiating for a number of weeks to try to get a package agreed to before the election. They were unable to. There was a lot of pressure in the Democratic caucus in the House on the Speaker to come to an agreement, even if it wasn't as big an agreement as she initially wanted. Because as you can see, there's a lot of pain out there. And while these members are running for re-election, while they're in these small towns across America, they're hearing from the folks who are suffering. So I think there's going to be some motivation to do something possibly during the lame duck. You're going to start seeing states announce layoffs or tax increases, try to make up for these deficits that the federal government hasn't come in to help with. States like New York, for instance, you're going to start hearing those type of states who pay more than $22 billion more in taxes than they receive back from the federal government, making a lot of noise that they need more assistance. Now, as far as the lame duck goes, I agree with Leslie completely. I don't think we're going to see a large stimulus type package, but we probably will see something. If nothing else happens in the lame duck, and it's a little early to talk about what's on that agenda, they're going to have to address government funding. And there's a continuing resolution that expires on December 11th. Congress is either going to need to kick that into next year to give them more time to negotiate a budget for next year, or they're going to have to finish the FY22 spending bills. I think if Joe Biden wins the White House, it's very likely they're going to kick that CR into next year. That's something that Congress always does when there's a new administration. But there's nothing stopping them from putting some relief onto that CR, whether that's some direct payments to people, extending unemployment. I think if we're going to see something during the lame duck, it's going to be one of those real kitchen table type issues that are specifically directed at helping families, helping individuals, things like that. But to Leslie's bigger point, 2 days ago, I would have said there's big plans for a stimulus package with a Biden win and a Democratic House and Senate. Talking with a colleague on Capitol Hill, there was a big expectation that the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee would put together a big package in time to get to Joe Biden's desk by Inauguration Day. Now, there's nothing stopping that from still happening, but we still have this situation in the Senate where Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has not had the appetite to put any sort of significant size stimulus on the Senate floor. The House passed their HEROES Act back in May. The Senate hasn't picked anything up. A couple weeks before the election, Mitch McConnell did put a $500 billion package on the floor that failed to receive enough votes to move forward. So we're still in a situation where the House Democrats are going to be pushing a larger package. They now have an ally in the White House who's more likely to support them, but there are still the roadblocks in the Senate to passing something bigger right now. I would mention when Congress is sworn in next year, the Senate will have two more former governors, John Hickenlooper from Colorado and Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming, who are bringing that governor's perspective, and that might be helpful to bringing Mitch McConnell along. I can tell you, I think Brian mentioned earlier, Governor Hogan and NGA, they're still working on not only additional funding for state and local governments, but the flexibility to use some of the previous funding to fill budget gaps. Those discussions are going to continue. I don't think the Democrats, at least in the House, have lost any of their support for this type of a large package. They've gained a supporter in the White House, but it's still going to take some time to bring the Senate along. I think with the Senate looking more and more like it's going to stay roughly the same as what it's been, there's going to need to be a lot of pressure on Senator McConnell to increase what he's willing to support.
Mm-hmm. And just to dovetail, sorry, with what Tom was saying on the stimulus, again, if you had asked me yesterday or the day before what I thought might happen in terms of the first or second quarter of next year, just as Tom was mentioning, we were talking about a large infrastructure package. We were talking about a potential green energy, sort of an environment package. I think all of that is very much not only up in the air, but sort of questionable as moving forward. Not to say that the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress can come to some agreement eventually on some sort of an energy package. It's just not going to look like what we thought it was going to look like. And it's not going to be sort of what the House put forward and what they voted on, back in late summer or actually in September. So it's going to, I think it's going to take a different tact. Again, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean there's not going to be infrastructure spending. It just means it's not going to look like what I think people expected it to look like maybe a couple days ago.
So if we assume that maybe the way the Senate ends up is 52-48 Republicans, so basically all of the uncalled seats at this point go to the Republicans. It just occurred to me as we were talking about this, how powerful does that make Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski?
Mm-hmm.
They continue to hold a lot of power. It makes Mitch McConnell very powerful, but it also means that he's got. I mean, we talked about Pelosi having a challenge on her hands. But Mitch McConnell does not have an easy road for the majority leader. He's got a caucus that, as you mentioned, you've got Susan Collins on the one hand, who's very much a moderate. Or the moderate stripe. You've got the Ted Cruz of the world, on the other hand, for example, who is, got an equal chance to filibuster, something. And so it's not going to be a simple task there.
But the one last thing I would, and as I mentioned earlier, there are 34 Senate seats up in 2 years. That's a lot of senators, and they can't go into their reelection having nothing to show for it after 2 years, this year and next year in office. So there will be some campaign-related motivation to get something done. It's been a long time since Congress has been able to pass something like an infrastructure package where members can turn around and show their constituents, I brought this money home, bring it home to bacon. We helped build this bridge. We helped improve this road. We helped improve this hospital. I do think there's going to be some motivation for that type of thing. We're just not there yet. I think there's going to need to be some more of a bit of a groundswell almost next year for the Senate to be willing to accept a bigger package. It's certainly not out of the question right now. We're still in kind of the hangover from last night, but there's certainly an appetite in the country for an infrastructure package. We've heard President Trump talk about it for 4 years. It's not something that Republicans are opposed to. It's just something that, with all the madness in the last 4 years, hasn't been a possibility. So as Leslie said, I don't think we're going to see the size and maybe the scope that we would have seen before. But I do have confidence that we're going to have to see some sort of a stimulus package into next year, whether it's in the first quarter or the second quarter, right now up for grabs.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we're going to feel a little bit like the news last night we were all watching. So did you all just get all your alerts that Wisconsin just got called?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's Wall Street, and then I'm in Atlanta, so the Atlanta Journal just called, or just got notice that Wisconsin was called. So based on that, what is that? What are you all beginning to think now?
I assume for Biden.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Without seeing the numbers right now, I've seen and heard that there's going to be a recount request for Wisconsin. You may have seen, earlier today, Governor Walker on Twitter commented on the idea of the recount. I don't know what the vote difference is now, but when he was involved in a recount a number of years ago, they were looking for a difference of around 300 votes, and that was insurmountable. Last I saw, the Wisconsin numbers were in the thousands, and his tweet earlier today was not very positive about how a recount would turn out for the president.
Tom, you mentioned in your comments on the infrastructure something about bringing home the bacon. What is yours and Leslie's analysis on the return of earmarks?
That's an interesting question. This is something that's been bubbling for a while since the Democrats took back the House, and there's a strong urge to bring back earmarks on the leadership side. Earmarks made legislation a lot easier to pass, and that kind of sounds a little maybe off, but what it means is it gave every member a little bit of skin in the game, and gave them a reason to support some legislation maybe they wouldn't have in the past. Now, I don't expect earmarks to come back next year. I think that if they're going to come back, I think there's going to be a discussion within the Democratic Party in the House next year about how they bring them back. One of the options that has been put on the table is opening up earmarks for public infrastructure type projects. Right now, the Army Corps of Engineers, for instance, does thousands of water projects across the country, and there's a process to get those funded. One of the ideas is to allow members of Congress to insert funding for authorized water projects, things like that have an authorized component to them, where there's a transportation authorizing bill, they would be able to fund them that way. It has not been a discussion to bring earmarks back in the form they were last time, where almost anyone was able to receive them. I'm not very confident that that's something Democrats are going to do for a couple of reasons. If Joe Biden does win the White House, Joe Biden was never a fan of earmarks. When he was in the Senate, he was a proponent of banning earmarks at one point. So they're not going to get help from the White House. And if the House was to bring them back, I would expect Mitch McConnell to pretty quickly announce that the Senate is not bringing back earmarks, which would make conference very difficult. If Democrats were to take the House and Senate, I think it's something one party could probably work out if they were controlling both chambers, but it's very hard to do when one chamber will have a defense bill filled with projects, and then the Senate comes in with a bill with none. So I think the discussion will continue through the year. I think Democrats would love to find a way to direct public infrastructure projects to their districts, but I don't see it happening right away.
Mm-hmm. I think you will continue to see, Dan, what we've seen over the last few years, which is a bigger push in the House and the Senate to do more defining within the appropriations bills about direction for funding. We call it kind of almost, we call them pseudo earmarks. They don't have a specific dollar amount associated with a specific entity, but nonetheless, they're very much teeing up particular entities through either language or certain kind of funding direction. And I do think that will continue. I mean, one thing we can say about Joe Biden in his many years in the Senate and understanding the dynamics of Washington is that he is somebody who I think a lot of people would say is a good negotiator. He wants to negotiate, wants to cut deals. And you take somebody like a Dick Shelby over in the Appropriations Committee. He's certainly not in the same ilk as some of the other caucus that's very fiscally conservative. I mean, he's looking to cut a deal as well to get his bills moving and that type of thing. So I do think that it's not going to be complete gridlock because I do think there's going to be some motion, like Tom mentioned, to move forward. But I do think that the gridlock that does happen is going to be around some of the bigger initiatives that the Democrats have been pushing prior to the election. And I doubtful that a lot of those are going to get through.
And I think, just real quick, one other challenge, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, who's the majority leader in the House, are both longtime appropriators. I think they both joined the House Appropriations Committee likely in the 90s, probably the mid-90s. They understand the process. They were involved in earmarks. They see the benefit of them. But the last year earmarks were funded was 2009. Most members of the House of Representatives were not here then. They weren't part of the process. The only thing they've experienced with earmarks is the bad press and all the negative connotations that have come with it. So before anything is able to happen in the House, I think the Democratic leadership needs to spend time educating and bringing their members along to why it's even a good idea.
So I worked with Steny Hoyer on it. I call them directed appropriations, not earmarks, back in the day when that was possible. But can I ask some questions about everyone about, I've been reading about the Endless Frontiers Act, and it's not an earmark, but it would create a $100 billion plus up to the National Science Foundation. But more importantly to my constituents and maybe to Charles, a $10 billion set aside to create these regional tech hubs. And hopefully, to Dan's point, it's also involved technicians and people. Not everyone, works in research parks has a PhD. That's one of the things, we've been trying to help educate folks that we have technical training programs and other kinds of things to bring in the community and our research parks. But on the broader issue of the Endless Frontiers Act, putting aside, this is just authorization, not appropriation, and it's very backloaded, so most of the funding comes in years 3 and 4, or 4 and 5. Tom and Leslie, and I'd love to get Charles's reaction. Do you think that it's more likely based on the election or less likely, or what do you guys think?
Well, my take on it is much less likely based on the election. I would have said that it was likely if we saw a pretty dramatic shift in the Senate, an even bigger shift in the House and the presidency. I think what we've seen over the last 24 hours makes me very skeptical that the Endless Frontiers Act is going to move. Okay. That being said, I do think that you may see a reauthorization of the National Science Foundation, for example. In just this last couple of months, the House put forward a draft reauthorization of the National Science Foundation, kind of as a counterbalance to the Endless Frontiers Act. They do envision increasing NSF, though not nearly to the levels that the Schumer bill does. And they do establish a sort of separate commercialization directorate within NSF. But you also see in the House, and this again is from the House Democrats, a different way of viewing the National Science Foundation. They're a little more hesitant to follow the Schumer bill in sort of taking NSF into a more applied direction. And so I do think that debate is going to continue to happen next Congress between the House and the Senate. So I don't think that it's just going away, but I think that especially the spending levels that you see and some of the policy that you see in the Endless Frontiers Act is unlikely to transpire. There's going to be longer debates about that.
Yeah, and I think at the most basic level, Endless Frontiers is a bill sponsored by Senator Schumer. And the likelihood of Senator McConnell bringing the Democratic leader's bill to a vote, to a committee hearing, is extremely unlikely. But that said, just because the Republicans are in charge of the Senate doesn't mean something big can't happen for NSF. We've seen Republicans pass Competes Acts and similar legislations. I know there is an appetite for something similar. It may not be next year, as the way it would be if the Democrats were in charge, but working with the Senate Commerce Committee staff, as long as we have, this is certainly something in their interest. And it wouldn't surprise me to see something, not frontiers, but something different to boost up NSF. One thing we've seen, and we go back in the last 10 years or so, whether it's been Republicans or Democrats in charge of Congress, they both have supported more funding for NSF. We've seen NSF, we've seen the Office of Science, we've seen a lot of these important research offices throughout the federal government grow, regardless of who's in charge. And as of with things shake down right now, I believe that Senator Moran will likely continue as CJS chairman in the Senate. There's no indication he's going to look to scale back any of the support for NSF. So I'm not optimistic on Endless Frontiers, but that doesn't mean something positive and good can't happen for NSF in the next couple of years.
But I do think, and I want to reiterate this, I agree. I think we will see a reauthorization of NSF. I think it's a real question of what the sort of it looks like in terms of the mission of NSF. And the many Democrats, including the leadership of the House Science Committee, but also Republicans would very much like to put that additional dollars that Tom is talking about into basic science research, and less of it into sort of tech transfer, commercialization types of things. I do think there is a definite member interest in doing that, so that's going to be part of the conversation. But how it fits in and in the scope of how it fits in, I think is definitely on the table and unlikely to be obviously to the scope that the Endless Frontiers envisions.
Yeah, and the 10 billion would have been, at least in the architecture, Endless Frontiers in Commerce Department. So it would have been through EDA and then competed.
Well, actually, and this is one of the quirks of the legislation, it is jointly administered by EDA and the Undersecretary of Commerce, who's the director of NIST. So it was this weird split.
I see.
One thing that I would say on this, and then let Charles jump in on this, is I think Tom and Leslie are absolutely right in terms of the impact of the election results. It is important to note that at least as of now in this Congress, and hopefully it will continue in the next Congress, the chairwoman of the subcommittee of the House Science Committee that oversees NSF and NIST is Haley Stevens from Michigan. Haley used to work at EDA. She worked at MXD, a Manufacturing USA Institute in Illinois. So she has good on the ground experience with these kinds of issues. So while it might not be Endless Frontier, there might be something else that we can pitch to Representative Stevens.
Dan, I'd have to say that definitely disappointed because as you know, we looked at this smorgasbord of different initiatives that could have been possible. Kind of felt like this morning was going to be Christmas morning for us in the entrepreneurship and innovation space, but that's not the case. But you know, one of the things I'd like to just share and emphasize is that I think when I look at our entrepreneurial community, you know, the kind of shot in the arm that the Frontiers Act could provide is definitely something that is needed. And you know, I looked at to just reminded of some statistics about just the stagnation that we're seeing in entrepreneurship across the country and across different industries. And, you know, getting more ideas into the pipeline and transferring investments from our research and development activities all helps with that. One of the things I'd love to run past Tom and Leslie is with some of the other initiatives that were a part or are a part of the Biden platform, specifically to help with entrepreneurs and maybe some of the areas around making more capital available to entrepreneurs. What is your sense in terms of what, if anything, there can survive in the short term?
I think there's a lot there the two sides can agree on. I think the bigger obstacle is how much are the Senate Republicans going to want to work with the Biden administration? We saw very early on when Obama took office that Mitch McConnell was very public and very clear that we're not going to work with the president. And we're going to make things very difficult for President Obama. And that worked. They controlled the Senate for a good percentage of his presidency, and they were able to block everything from judges to other large packages. So it depends on how much I think the Senate wants to work with a Biden administration. But Charles, the areas you just mentioned are things that the two sides can work on and aren't necessarily partisan. I think the bigger question will be, what's the atmosphere going to be like on Capitol Hill? What legislation and debates will take place before they get to the type of commercialization programs that possibly poison the water a bit? But those are areas that when they're putting together a larger infrastructure package that you can find bipartisan support by bringing in members from both sides. Because look, every member of the House just finished campaigning all across the country. They see the problems that are out there. They see the need in the community. They see the economic troubles that small businesses and others are facing right now. So I think there's going to be a lot of support at the individual member level The question is, can they overcome some of the leadership challenges where, where it's more partisan than policy?
Mm-hmm.
And Charles, I might also add, a lot of what Joe Biden was putting forward in his platform is also premised on the fact of having a little more revenue to work with, meaning there was, obviously a push for tax increases. I think that that's pretty much dead in the water at this point. And so you've got a situation where there's not as much money on the table that could go into some of these initiatives that the Democrats have been proposing here for over the last few months. And so I think that's going to limit what they can do in terms of scope. But I agree with Tom, it doesn't necessarily limit what you can do in terms of a desire to do something in innovation.
Hey, we're beginning to get a couple of questions from the audience. Let me ask one. Great insights. If Biden wins, what are the key STEM issues and immigration changes that we will expect to see an increase in H-1Bs again?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll jump in there. I think that obviously if under a Biden presidency, he's going to try to do as much as he can via administration rulemaking, essentially. And so I think you'll see a lot of the current rules that are at least been proposed around H-1B visas and a variety of other topics that really affect higher ed. I think those are probably going to shift. Now, that being said, I do think the China issue around innovation is not going away. It's not going away in terms of the Biden presidency, and it certainly isn't going away in terms of a Republican Senate. So I don't think that those issues are just going to kind of disappear overnight, though I do think that you will see some of these late-breaking proposed rules be overturned very early in a Biden administration.
Yeah, I agree with Leslie. I've been on and around Capitol Hill for 20 years, and any immigration-related legislation is incredibly difficult to get through. I wouldn't be surprised to see Biden, as Leslie said, do what he can to roll back some of the Trump executive orders. It wouldn't surprise me to see the House do something on DACA and have that sit in the Senate with very little action. I would not expect to see another penny put towards the wall going forward. I think that's something we would immediately see go away. And I don't think there'd be much Republican resistance to that. You'll recall the first 2 years of President Trump's time in office, he did control the House and Senate with Republicans, and there was not a penny put towards the wall during that time. The push for the money wasn't until the Democrats won that midterm election. So I think we'll see things like the wall start to disappear. And I think the tone, more than anything else, will change on how the administration handles immigration. But the chance for legislation is very slim.
Hey, Charles, we got a couple for you, both somewhat related. Where do you see the greatest opportunity or need for the support of incubation and entrepreneur support organizations, and what key policy changes are needed for startups? And anybody can jump on them, but we'll have Charles.
Sure. So for specifically the entrepreneurial support organizations, I think we touched upon really the most immediate opportunity and that is around the stimulus and to be able to get funds to the state and local governments, state governments that are basically major stakeholders of majority of these entrepreneurship centers. I think that goes a long way in addressing needs that we haven't really started at a crescendo yet, but will be at a crescendo in the next couple of months. And then I think always next on top of the list for entrepreneurship centers is really funding for their clients. And so anything that can free up more capital for small businesses and startup businesses, and specifically around dealing with these issues of access to capital for people of color, businesses led by people of color and women entrepreneurs, I think that those things would be very, very critical in needs. And what was the second part of that, Kevin?
What policy changes do we need to see more startups? How do we create an innovation policy system in the U.S.?
Yeah, so definitely access to capital is key. I think the other area is around access to opportunity. So One of the things that I think the current administration has done a great job with is in terms of putting more emphasis on how we can remove regulation to speed up the pace of business. And I think any kind of regulatory relief, regulation relief from startups is really critical.
And Charles, something that you said triggered a thought on my end as well. It wouldn't surprise me to see in a Biden administration trying to, if they don't have new budget authority, then looking at existing programs to figure out how they can address persons of color and disadvantaged communities. So looking at SBA and increased emphasis for minority entrepreneurs, for example.
Agreed.
Hey,
so related to that, one topic we're interested in, AURP, a surprisingly large number of our members are in opportunity zones. I know that actually was started an idea from a former Obama official, but it's had its rough start. But do you guys see any major changes coming into the opportunity zone legislation? Before we get into that, I just wanted to remind everyone, we do have a research park in Delaware, we have a research park in Kentucky, and we have a research park in San Francisco. So when we're talking about building coalitions, we do have some boots on the ground that help once we get everyone elected and in office. But anyway, so what do you guys think about opportunity zones? Will that continue, and will there be reforming of the legislation? Because there's been criticism it's not been helping the clients that it was designed to.
I don't see anything moving on its own, targeting opportunity zones. If there's a large infrastructure package, if there's a large, we talk about endless frontiers, a large, some sort of technology package, maybe there could be some tweaks. I don't see, with everything else that has to be addressed, I don't see opportunity zones on their own being a target. But again, if they were looking to do some sort of more comprehensive package that could impact opportunity zones, there could be some tweaks done there. But until Democrats, at least on the House side, get through things like healthcare, infrastructure, and voting rights, I think the opportunity zones themselves are a bit of a lower priority.
Okay. And going along with that, Tom, I wonder, given how much the Trump administration embraced opportunity zones, how much appetite there would be from a Biden administration to take that issue on?
It certainly isn't something I've heard them talk about publicly, and it hasn't risen to that level at this point. So I don't think it's at the top of anyone's hit list at this point, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on.
All right, let's talk globally. So AURP has an international network. NBIA has an international network. How do we leverage that network to promote and lobby for science and tech policy? Brian, you want to take that?
So we're going to have a panel on that topic on Friday afternoon. So we have some speakers from Utah, Maryland, and California, and the head of the state international development organization. So there are 50 chapters in each state, and they are interested in helping make sure that we still have robust trade and also scientific relationships, because the one thing, our research parks are very much science oriented, and science is international. So we need to continue to help make sure that we remove those barriers for that kind of collaboration that's helping on things like COVID-19, helping on things like autonomous systems, helping on AI and all the other things that's going to improve our health. And it's, we have to balance that with the issues with China. And, I sort of want to throw this back to Tom and Leslie. The issues on China, it's surprising to me because I read Schumer's bill about, I forget, leading America, and it had sort of a anti-China sort of approach that you would have thought Donald Trump had written it. So the House Democrats, I mean, what is their view going to be on trade with China?
On trade or on some of these broader issues of security?
Well, I'll just say relationships with China. You can break it down.
Right. I do think trade policy aside, because I do think there will likely be under a Biden administration a very different trade policy moving forward broadly. But going back to this issue of just China and I would call national security, issues broadly that obviously universities are grappling with, national labs are grappling with, I do not see that going anywhere, really. I don't see that going anywhere different than where it is right now, because there is a lot of bipartisan support for more controls at the agencies and at the agency grants recipients, so essentially universities, labs, et cetera, and industry. And that's certainly not going away because, again, it is bipartisan. But certainly then with a Republican-led Senate, for example, using things like the National Defense Authorization Act or other kind of appropriations bills, they've been very clear about establishing more and more of those controls, the NIST, 800, 171 types of controls. And so I really do not see those going away or changing dramatically in the next administration. So I definitely think that's going to be a continued interest and issue for technology, industry, and mostly universities.
And I agree with Leslie. When I have questions on this topic, I go to Leslie with those questions. I want to echo what she said.
Tom, let me ask you about the just prospects for, say, Latin America and Europe. So that's where I think for NBIA, many of our members we have a strong footprint in that part of the world, and we actually have some collaboration activities in place specifically in Latin America. And in the previous administration, we had several of the countries that were fairly restricted in their ability to do entrepreneurial exchanges here with the U.S. because of the foreign aid, I guess, potential embargo. So any thoughts on that?
I think depending on which countries you're talking about, I think a lot of that will be scaled back in a Biden administration. Now, I think issues with North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, I think those types of countries will remain. But I think that a lot of the restrictions we've seen in the last 4 years on Central and South America will probably be a bit relaxed under the Biden administration because it's not going to be a central focus. We're not going to hear a lot about those issues, I think, with Biden in the White House.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Tom.
Great.
Hey, one thing that I've just got to applaud, it's not breaking news at all, but it's interesting that for the last hour, we've talked about politics and nobody said the word COVID at all. So we've got about 2 minutes left. Spend a minute or so on what does COVID look like in a different administration? What are y'all hearing about any changes? And, we like to say we're at the tip of the spear in helping solve the COVID pandemic. So, how do we get policy to help our research parks fulfill that need?
Well, I'll jump in quickly. I definitely think that you will see some changes under, say, a Biden administration. He's already talked about bringing back a sort of a czar in the White House to help coordinate some of the policy around COVID response. But, on some level, there's only so much he can do, or really anybody in the administration can do. I mean, a lot of this is up to states. A lot of it is just kind of out of the hands of any one individual. So I think you'll see more of a centralization of a response nationally under a Biden administration, but I'm not sure you're going to see dramatically different policies under a Biden administration in that regard. But to your second point, Kevin, which is more related to funding, I do think you will see another, I'm going to call it a relief package, and I do think there's going to be quite a bit of funding there for vaccine development, which of course could take place in an entrepreneurial environment, not just at sort of the big vaccine makers. A lot more emphasis on sort of new innovation around medical devices or different kinds of ventilation systems and this types. And we've already seen at Department of Defense, a huge increase in funding around sort of innovative technologies to combat pandemic and pandemic responses and things of that nature. I think that's going to continue into next year. So I think in terms of healthcare and pandemic response, I'm pretty bullish on what's.
Which is a perfect segue. There's the optimistic bull that we all are. So, well, with that, our time's up. And what we'd like to do is, I'm going to put this on Brian's plate, is invite this group back in January and have a separate session where we just go through another one of these. Again, this has been informative. I've gotten different comments from others as this has been going on about how informative it is. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, the wonderful Brian Darmody. This has been great. And I hope everybody sticks around now this afternoon for university industry engagement. But for now, we'll call this panel complete. But thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mm.